So I wanted to talk through some strategies on how to read a research article. And so I picked a particular article that I thought would be of interest. So it's specifically Organic Farming Favors Insect Pollinated over Non-Insect Pollinated Forbs in Meadows and Wheat Fields. Now, some of the first things I noticed in this title are that favors is spelled with a U, so that tells me that this is probably a European paper, and you're actually going to notice that a lot of the research happens from Europe, which is interesting, and I'm not quite sure why that is. The other was that I didn't know what forbs meant, but I knew that I wanted something around insect pollination, so I was interested in the article anyway, but I found out that forbs means any herb that is not a grass or grass-like. So I looked that word up just because I wanted to make sure that indeed this was an article I wanted to read. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of read through sort of the article, but also some of the strategies I used to read this article, because what I'd like for you to do is try and identify one or two strategies that I've used that you might be able to use as well to help you when you are reading your own research article. So the first thing I did was I looked at the abstract, and the abstract is essentially sort of a summary of what the research is about. And so you'll see there's some stuff underlined there. Particularly, I sort of looked at what are some of the different, sort of things that they're looking at, right? So they're looking at landscape scale management intensity, local management intensity, and edge effect on diversity of insect pollinated versus non-insect pollinated materials, right? These forbs in meadow and wheat fields. Okay. Specifically 9 different landscapes. So then I tried to sort of break down what were those 9 different landscapes. And so I started to kind of make a little map, right? So the percent intensity was something that they're looking at, and they're looking at organic versus conventional of wheat fields and meadows. So I'm trying to kind of draw out what I think is going on. And then they also talk about the fact that they're focusing on both the edge of a field and the interior. So I tried to kind of visually map that out. And then at the end here, they have sort of the sort of big sort of so what, right? That sort of take-home message that is sort of why this research is of interest. So what's nice about an abstract is it really kind of gives you a big overall summary of what the whole research paper is going to be about. So it gives you a good anticipatory set. Now I come down here, and the next thing I did was kind of read through the introduction. And so what I found was, of course, these numbers, so it's one citation style. There's other citation styles you'll probably see in your papers. But this sort of lists the different references that it's talking about. And then, and so it kind of talks about here, it's sort of situating why this is an area of concern or why this is interesting. They sort of talk about the fact that this is situated within a political and economic consequences for the decisions that they're making about biodiversity. And then later they're coming up here, and they're sort of situating their work within sort of the literature that's come before, the work that's done before. In particular, work that's similar, right? So it sort of starts with more general and then gets to more specific work relative to where their work is situated, and then sort of how they identify how their work is unique relative to all of this other work that's come before. And then I kind of went through and said, okay, so what is it that they wanted to know, right? So these are their 3 hypotheses. So this is a really dense paper because they have 3 different hypotheses that they're testing within this research. But they also have sort of this very specific work that actually supports why they're developing this hypothesis, which is sort of a nice sort of lead into not just here's our work, here's the work, here's where our work kind of ties into it, but then specifically here's some of the compelling research that's come before and why we're developing our hypothesis around that. The next thing I did was just kind of look at the headings of the different parts of the paper. So I have the methods. They kind of talk about the area that they've studied. So it's in Germany, the 35-kilometer radius, right? So they're kind of just giving the basic background, the equipment that they're using, all that fun stuff. There's some tables that I'm going to come back to. They have the results. They have a discussion and supporting information, acknowledgments, references. Right, so nothing out of the ordinary, doesn't necessarily tell me too much about the titles. Sometimes the titles can tell me more about what the paper's been about. So then the next thing I did was dig into the figures. So here you can see I've kind of marked up the figures on here, and this really starts to synthesize exactly what this paper is about without having to have read anything, right? So we've got that organic versus conventional, the lines here mean the standard error mean, so how much variance there is within each of these measurements. And so you can see insect pollinated versus non-insect pollinated. Essentially, we're kind of trying to look for this as being beneficial, and the higher is better, right? So these are sort of some of the variables. This is looking at the total amount of species, so this is our total diversity. These are showing that they're statistically significant in meadow environments, whereas in wheat fields, the only one that's statistically significant, if you look at these error bars, where they're offset, is with this organic edge, not within the interior, not within any of the conventional settings. So then I move to table, and this table starts to show all these different variables that they're looking at. And the p variable, when it's less than 0.5, tells you what's significant, right? So we've got the places where it is statistically significant is telling you that conventional is less than organic in terms of species richness. That the IP versus NP, let's see, I come down here, interior, insect pollinated versus non-insect pollinated. So insect pollinated is greater than non-insect pollinated for species richness, right? So it's sort of, you can kind of come down and sort of figure out what sort of the main beneficial effects are. What are the most things? So here, 0.048 is like right on the edge of whether it's statistically significant or not. So it's just barely. So again, then I kind of skipped ahead. I went over here, looked at this other one. So this is percent coverage versus percent species. So it's showing sort of the amount of coverage versus figure 1 was showing more the diversity, but same basic trends. And then I went to the last figure, let's see, which was these obnoxious graphs. Here we go. These RDA plots, which the RDA plots I'm not super familiar with, and so I kind of struggled through them a little bit. But ultimately what I found from reading the text was that these plots are essentially showing that there's a greater amount of diversity and a greater range of different types of species that are present with organic farms than are with conventional. Now, I'm not quite sure what this is showing, but essentially in wheat fields we get less variation, in meadow fields more less. So the RDA plots are still a little bit of a mystery to me. And they're a statistical analysis process. So they're basically kind of reducing down some of the information. So trying to take a lot of these tables that are in format and kind of going through there. So then I went back to results. So now that I've read the tables and the charts, I have sort of an idea of what's going on. There's some supplemental tables that might give me more information. Table 1, again, I don't really need to read some of this stuff because I kind of already figured out from the tables, right? So it's kind of going through sort of some of their results. I star some of the things that I think are particularly important. And then here is sort of here's how their results are significant. And then essentially sort of saying, when we manage the farms for crops, organic farming has a greater impact. And that's really important, particularly from that sort of economic standpoint, from that political standpoint, that if it's going to guide policy, it becomes important. And then through here, so all of their results are correlational, right? They're looking at what is the results, not necessarily looking at the causes, but here they're positing possible causes for why this might be going on. They're situating with the context of other research that's come before. But essentially, they're sort of giving some causal possible explanations, but not from their research, but sort of based on what their results say, they're interpreting what they think it means. And then again, this is sort of why this then becomes important and the reason that we care from a political and economic standpoint. And ultimately, that there are some places where there may be some weaknesses, right, some inconsistencies, but that ultimately which then drives sort of future research and why this might be of interest. So those are just some general tips and some strategies. Gives you a little bit of a better sense of sort of how I go about, here, the sort of ultimate take-home message, right? So gives you a sense of sort of how you go about reading a research paper. I hope that helped.